Guy, let's say hello to you, because you come a long way, haven't you, this evening to join us?
Yeah, I come all the way to the studio, which is why it all looks so brilliant and mythological behind me.
Guy is in a different studio, but in the same studio complex where the Idler office is. He was quite disappointed by the Idler office, weren't you? It wasn't really very bucolic.
No, it was the most industrial place I've ever been to, I think. So, not in a way that's brilliant. The contrast is the truth. Yeah.
Well, guys, thanks so much for coming in this evening. We're going to talk about that sort of slight wound on your lip in a moment. But before we do that, can we get a little bit of biography? I mean, as Vic said, you've got these three sort of complementary projects going on. And they're all, they're just all so good. I mean, they're just the kind of things that we want to do in the Idler. I think all three of them are sort of, bringing joy and cheerfulness and, something deeper into people's lives. There's the fun and the singing. You yourself are a singer, and you did your PhD in singing. So can you tell us a little bit about that study and how perhaps that led to the original idea of the Pilgrimage Trust?
Okay, well, going back to when I was 5 years old, I just loved dance, running around wildflower meadows and being with animals, and I knew lots about bugs and birds and things. And I got all the magazines. I think it was called Bugs or something like that. And then something happened. I became a choir boy, and then that side of my life just went to one side, and I started focusing on singing. And you have to become quite professional as a sort of 6 or 7 year old. It's quite a weird thing. My mum said, ever since that moment, she kind of I became sort of adult in a strange way. And then when I lost my voice, I came back, and then it was end of school. Then I went to Cambridge, and then became a choral scholar at Trinity choir. And then I loved it. We touring the world, and it gave me so much. The singing was my life really. And then I wanted to do a PhD, and then it transpired that I was going to work on group singing and how it forms community. So it's like an anthropological survey around the world, and then a psychological investigation, like scientifically, into the actual rhythmic synchronization process in choirs. And that led me into far-flung areas like Rupert Sheldrake's work on schools of fish and flocks of birds and how they move as one, and the collective movement of that, and then linking that with how singers in choirs sing. And it was great. I mean, every single chapter was a different discipline. It was really mind expanding in many ways, but it was behind a laptop, a lot of it. And as I got towards the end, I felt this burning need to kind of escape the four walls of my PhD sort of hole, like my room, and actually get out into the wild. And I was actually house sitting for Rupert Sheldrake at the time, because I got to know through my PhD his wife, who teaches overtone chanting.
Now,
And then
let's rewind slightly, because just in case our audience aren't all aware of exactly who Rupert Sheldrake is, I mean, Mark mentioned him earlier. We know him most recently probably as the father of Merlin Sheldrake, who wrote the book about funguses and so on a couple of years ago. Rupert, how would you describe him? He's a biologist, perhaps a little esoteric. He was kind of semi-banned by TED. I guess he's about 18. And I think he lives on Hampstead Heath, Guy, doesn't he? And
yeah,
your first encounter with him was almost sort of accidental, really, because as you say, it was his wife that you originally met.
Yeah. What would I say about Rupert? He was a director of studies of cell biology at Cambridge until he was about 29, 30. And then he realized that the strictures of academia were going to hold him back from exploring collective consciousness and consciousness that extends beyond the mind, and also, but more specifically, memory and how that affects development of biological organisms and all in nature and the cosmos itself, and how laws of nature work perhaps more as habits. And he went to India for 7 years, and at the last, as a crop physiologist, so he doubled the chickpea and pigeon pea rate across India. So he had a big impact on crop practices on an industrial scale. And at the end of that, he was in an ashram with his father, B. Griffiths, and he wrote this book about morphic resonance, which is this theory of collective memory or memory throughout nature and across time and across space. So yeah, unusual stuff. And then ever since then, he's sort of lived a scientist life of private benefaction, if that's the right word. And
sort of independent scholar. He's not allied to Cambridge or anything.
Yeah, not allied to an institution, so he's freer. And so that freedom of mind was a great inspiration. And especially as I've been in this quite constricting academic environment. And so, yeah, met his wife who did overtone chanting, Mongolian, where you split this, you take a sound and then you split it into all its different parts. So there's like the atoms of sound. And then at the end of the first day, she said, "I'd like to introduce you to my husband." And so I met Rupert, and then the book, and then the schools of fish, the flocks of birds, and then house sitting with them, and then her sons Merlin and Cosmo Sheldrake. Cosmo's a musician, Merlin's the entangled life of fungal, mycorrhizal mushroom guy. And they invited these two wandering minstrels. And one of them particularly was regaling of stories about sleeping in the wild, cooking by the campfire, washing themselves in rivers and eating, foraging for food, and singing folk songs along the way and winning beds in strangers' houses. And it just all sounded completely magical and much better than my PhD existence. And I just thought, well, when I'm done, I will call him and see if he's up for going for a walk. So I did when I finished. And then he said, all right, let's take, for a week, let's take a song back to where it came from. And this song was Heartlake Bridge Tragedy. And this guy was called Will Parsons. And the Heartlake Bridge Tragedy song was actually a song that had been referred to Will by Sam Lee, the folk singer you may know. And it'd been taken from the library archives of Cecil Sharp House in Camden Town, which is an amazing place for folk song and folk culture in general, the English Folk Song and Dance Society. So if you ever want to learn anything about that culture, just go to the librarians. They'll tell you everything you could ever want. But we wanted to take the song out of the archive and into the land and basically rewild the song in its natural habitat. So this was the Heartlake Bridge Tragedy. And so we walked for a week. And then when we got to the monument that was commemorating the 37 hop pickers, travelers who had died in this tragedy, there was this tiny little monument, and there was a couple standing in front of it in the middle of this parish churchyard. There was no one else there, and no one else really in the village. It was this village called Hadlow. And we said, "What are you doing here?" And they said, "Well, we tried to find this place 10 years ago, but we couldn't find it. And then now we're here for 5 minutes, but we're about to leave." And we're like, "What's your connection to the tragedy?" And they said, "Well, 3 of my ancestors died in the tragedy." We're like, "Wow, this is really amazing. We've been walking for a week and sleeping in the wild and all this stuff and 70 miles. And then we're like, have you heard the song? We're singing this song to everyone. Have you heard it?" And assuming they had, because it was their song pretty much. And they hadn't heard it. So we'd gone with the intention of bringing the song back to its place where it was born, and the place, taking it back to its place of origin. But it was actually taking the song back to the bloodline. And we didn't even know that was going to be what we were doing. And I think I walked away from it, and I think we were both pretty moved. And I found it pretty overwhelming. I found it, and I realized that we needed to, there's something more powerful about the journey we'd just undertaken that was beyond just a walk or a hike. It had some kind of narrative and intentional purpose to it that went beyond. It was more like a quest, went beyond ordinary walking. And that quest created its own form of magic in terms of coincidence. We had other coincidences along the way too. we met Barry from EastEnders, who'd weirdly done a documentary on hot picking, so that was like an example of another one. And that level of coincidence, that frequency of coincidence was unknown to Will, who'd been walking for 10 years before that. And he took a lot longer to do his walks, and they were less focused in terms of having a narrative or intention. And so he realized that there was something powerful about this contracted journey where you give it a strong intention. And so we thought, well, what's this like? What is this? And we're like, well, maybe it's a pilgrimage. And we're like, well, we can't use the word pilgrimage because that's religious. And then we thought, well, why not? Because actually Henry VIII had banned pilgrimage, we then discovered. And we thought in 1538, he got Thomas Cromwell to write an injunction banning pilgrimage in this country, and also the vagrancy laws, so that if you were caught outside the parish of your birth, you could be whipped back to your parish. So the idea of like escaping and walking was suddenly somehow condemned, and it was suddenly a bad thing to do. And this taboo against this kind of what some people see as tramp-like behavior, it's got sort of wrapped up in that. And all this comes from the Henry VIII Reformation period. And we thought, let's reclaim this word. Let's, that horrible word, rebrand it and give it a whole new meaning, define it differently, and reclaim its juiciness. I think it's a lot of richness to the word. And
pilgrimages, I mean, they were very juicy things, weren't they, in the medieval period? I mean, Mark was talking about perhaps the health benefits, but reading something like Chaucer and particularly and hearing about the Wife of Bath, they were rowdy holidays. They were like 18 to 30 trips. They were like the way people went around the world, weren't they? They went in big groups. They probably had sex with other people, and it was a way of I mean, there's actually very little, if any. I don't think there's very little kind of religious talk, isn't there, in the Canterbury Tales?
Yeah, I mean, we say there are as many reasons for doing pilgrimage as there are pilgrims. So I think there will be some people that would have been doing it for religious observance reasons. Others would have been doing it for just a holiday, a holy day, and to basically down their tools and just get out. The same sort of reason I did it, just to walk out away from your home with towards an unknown destination with a true heart, is I think a Chaucerian phrase. But yeah, though, I mean, as the British Pilgrimage Trust, we don't generally advocate having sex, particularly not in churches. But holy sex is obviously like on the agenda if you really, really want. But I guess yeah, there's a fun to it, and I think like Chaucer's pilgrims some of them don't even get to the cathedral because they get so drunk in the pub beforehand they actually fall off their chair and fall asleep. So there is that side of pilgrimage, but it's a big container basically that allows all sorts of human behavior, like all sorts of ways of engaging with the world, with each other, with yourself. And it has a lovely rhythm to it. There will be moments of rapture and awe and wonder and mystery, but mixed in with silliness and for some people, drunkenness in pubs, at the end of a long day's walking, and others for like emotional exploration. As you walk along, the durational aspect. If you do multi-day routes or multi-week routes, you drop into this different pace of engaging with yourself, and emotions and old wounds and old things that have happened to you bubble up to the surface, and you have to start walking it out. The walking process really is sort of drops you into meditation automatically. I think there's a bit of a resistance to meditating, like in a self-help kind of well-being way, and sitting and taking the time out of the day and making sure you do it. But there's something that walking just makes it happen automatically without necessarily too much conscious effort. And I think that's a really powerful aspect of it. And also when you're walking alongside your friends and your companions, you're not looking at each other directly in the eye, and when you come to the end of a point or a conversation, you can just walk gently together without necessarily talking to each other. There's a different rhythm than when you sit opposite someone in a cafe and you've got like a certain amount of time to talk to them. It's a more natural rhythm and makes conversation and the depth of conversation easier. Also, strangers treat you differently. There's something about the traveler, the way people interact with the traveler. They ask them questions. They maybe offload their life story in a way they usually wouldn't, because you're moving through, you're passing through, you're not a threat. You're not going to stay or stick around. You connect with nature. You start to notice the animals and plants. You're going at such a slow pace that you've got enough time to do that. And then there are these moments sometimes when you're engaged with stuff beyond ordinary kind of earthly nature, and perhaps the cosmos, the stars, and bigger things beyond that. So it's a really varied experience, and there are all sorts of practices you can do. You can light candles at churches, you can lie on the ground looking at the sky on the tops of hills, or you can put your hands in the water in the running brook. You can drink the holy waters of wells. You can touch trees and ask them questions, like the Ents, treating them like Ents in the Lord of the Rings. And you can have lots of fun with the way you engage with nature. And it's because, like, as Mark said at the beginning, it's embodying, it's putting your body in the place. You can't really do pilgrimage unless you're actually in these places, and you can't just think about it. You have to be there, and that is embodiment. And so when you're there, you start to feel like you want to engage with these places in certain ways. There are no rules, to a certain extent, you can do whatever you like. And that's, for the modern mindset, trying to rediscover their spirituality. It's like a kind of beginner's introduction to spirituality, but it levels for everyone. Everyone can find their own way. You could have super holy, like mega guru type people. And then you could have someone who's never really thought about matters of spirituality, and they're just like, what's all this about? And they can go for a walk, and both will get something from the journey. That there's a humility to just walking for the sort of super enlightened being or whatever. And then there's something that goes beyond belief and needing to know anything at all for the person who's never engaged with it. And so it's a practice, and it doesn't require you to believe anything. And I think that's what makes it so strong.
It's so powerful. And it could have an effect on the economy, couldn't it, Guy? As you were talking, I was thinking, well, presumably in the old days, in medieval periods, all over Europe, you would have seen loads of pilgrims walking around. There would have been pubs at the corners, taverns, and so on. Your pilgrims, the pilgrimage renaissance that you created with others, could have a fantastic effect on small local towns, cathedral towns, pubs in the countryside, And
yeah,
I think that Rupert Sheldrake mentioned that you'd even mentioned this to quite a senior government minister who was quite enthusiastic about the idea. Is that the case?
Yeah, I found myself at this party of a sister publication to the Idler, let's say, and bumped into Michael Gove, who is the Housing, Communities and Levelling Up Minister. And I suggested that why not have hostels built along particular pilgrimage routes in Britain to create caminos in Britain. And I said, the way that it worked in Santiago de Compostela, the route along Camino Frances, is in 1993, I think, the government had £130 million pot to spend or something in the North Galician Council. And this rather visionary council leader decided he'd spend that money on building hostels for pilgrims along the route. And we could do that, but we're also focusing. And so Michael Gove really liked the idea and said very kindly that he would make this happen. Let's see whether it happens.
The Minister for
Pilgrimage. Yeah, why not? I mean,
ministry.
That would be great. Minister for Pilgrimage.
Incredible. Well
suggest
done.
it.
The heart of power there.
Tom, with all of your contacts, I'm sure you can make this happen. So yeah, but we're also focusing on churches as well, and church halls and village halls. So community-run buildings and accommodations. So we're calling it Sanctuary, and we have about 100 churches that are offering it or want to offer it. And this is for £10 a night. You can put a sleeping bag and a roll mat down on an ancient church floor or in the church hall, the village hall, and the communities run it, and they get 100% of all the revenue. And we have a network on our website, britishpilgrimage.org, to promote all of these community run accommodation. I think that would be great for these churches who otherwise may not have ways of making money, like cake sales and other, the rattling the tins to fix the roof. It's just a constant struggle for these churches. So giving them a relevance, and there's even a Bible quote that sorts this out, which is, "Come unto me those who are weary and laden and heavy." I've lost it now. And I shall give you rest is the point. And so this idea that we can actually give people rest and sanctuary when they're on pilgrimage, and it feels really great. And also there's this other aspect of sleeping in an ancient sacred space, which is dream incubation, which is the idea that you can have healing dreams in these spaces when you sleep overnight. So, and that also has biblical substance, because Solomon went up to the top of a mountain and slept in the temple of Gibeon, and it had a dream and was given an understanding heart and also money and power as well, because he asked for an understanding heart, he got given all that. So dreaming can be very powerful. And I'm using these Bible references not because I'm a Bible guy that always uses references, but because it's actually really deep, this tradition. It's not just made up contemporary stuff that we're just like, we're just sort of making a kind of a go of a situation where churches are losing relevance perhaps for a lot of people, and giving them a new kind of snazzy purpose. This is an old practice.
Now, have you had any, you mentioned that pilgrimage was cracked down on by Henry VIII in the Reformation, Cromwell and so on. It's only recently come back. Are there any sort of anti-pilgrim movements out there today because the Puritans and the Presbyterians and the Protestants are still sort of going strong, aren't they? You haven't had any kind of angry letters.
Well,
extreme
Tom, you're asking all of the most juicy questions. Funnily enough, yes, there are people who don't like the fact we say bring your own beliefs, because they think we're sort of being anti-religious. I'm hearing this charge more and more, and it's quite interesting, because I don't feel anti-religious. I just feel like I'm trying to open it up and create a neutral space so that people can engage with these spaces in practice rather than with specific beliefs. There's something to do with the Protestant philosophy, which was a shift from the body to the mind. So this is actually very relevant for what Mark was saying at the beginning about embodiment, because Erasmus was a great intellectual, but he was a sort of like a slightly disembodied Stephen Hawking type figure, who was really interested in shifting towards religion of the mind and spirituality of the mind. Pilgrim's Progress by Bunyan is like a pilgrimage of the mind, not the body. And there was a shift in general of the Protestants towards like studying the Bible, the word of God, rather than the practice and the smells and the bells and the prostration and the using your body to be engaged with spirituality. And so, yeah, in the more evangelical wings, I think there is, for some people, a sense that God is everywhere, and therefore you don't need to worship him in specific places or worship her in specific places. But that would be, again, a weird thing to say. But I think that's part of it, is this idea, yeah, but it's everywhere, so why do you need to bring it back to ancient places? And I just think, like anywhere, there are some places that have been prized for certain kinds of behavior and experience than others for everything we do. Like pubs have a different feeling to restaurants, and cinemas have a different feeling to theaters, and football stadiums have a certain purpose too, and they have a certain feel. And I think churches are great, and holy wells are brilliant, and ancient trees and prehistoric stone circles and sources of rivers and caves, islands, hilltops. They all have their own special feeling, and they all do different things to you.